Kasaysayan patungkol sa martial law, muling balikan. Philippine Representative Sean Riley Alcoseba nagkamit ang unang parangal sa dance competition laban sa ibang bansa. Music video ng pop singer Jen Manzanero na i-release na. Dance cover ng TikTok queen Princess Castillo nag-trending sa buong South Korea. Babaeng umiiyak sa pagsagot ng math nag-viral sa social media. Magandang buhay Luzon, Visayas at Mindanao. Sa panahon ngayon, marami pa rin ang tila hindi makalimot sa ating kasaysayan. Sa deklarasyong ito ni dating Pangulong Marcos, nagsimula ang isa sa pinakamadilim na yugto ng kasaysayan ng Pilipinas. September 21, 1972, pinirmahan ang Proclamation 1081. Pero September 23 idineklara sa publiko. Kasabay nito ang pagkuha ni Marcos sa lahat ng kapangyarihan ng gobyerno. Ipinasara ang ilang serbisyo gaya ng Meralco, Philippine National Railways at maging ilang airlines. Pina-shutdown din ang ilang TV outlet kabilang ang 7 TV station at halos 300 radio stations. Ipinaaresto ang 4 na senador at nasa 8,000 individual. Marahil kayo nagtataka ngunit talagang itong lahat ay nangyari lamang sa loob ng isang araw. Pero simula pa lamang yan ng diktatoryang nagtagal ng halos 14 na taon na umabot na sa ibaba ang damputan kabilang sa inaresto ang nooy guro na si Eta Rosales na naiuugnay kay Communist Party of the Philippines Public Chairman Jose Maria Sison. Sa ikalawang aresto ni Rosales noong 1976 ay nagdulot ng bangungot na hindi na mabubura. Ngunit ano nga ba ang martial law? Ang pagdeklara ng Pangulo sa martial law ay isa sa mga kapangyarihan niya bilang Commander-in-Chief ng Armed Forces of the Philippines. Dagdag pa rito ay nararapat lamang na gamitin ang kapangyarihang ito upang sa mga panahon ng krisis ay mas maprotektahan ng mga tao at mapamahagi ng mabilis ang hustisya. Sa martial law, pinapalitan nila ang sibilyan na pamamahala ng gobyerno sa isang militar na pamamahala o may tuturing nating batas militar. Sa isang military rule, maaaring lumago ang paghatol ng mga korteng militar sa mga individual na mga sibilyan, sa curfews, at ang suspension ng habeas corpus.
Ma'am, I am Camille Orsine, the interviewer from His Story News. I would like to ask lang po if sa panahon na si Marcos ang tumatakbo and saksi po kayo sa oras na yon, ano ang naging epekto ng martial law sa panlipunan?
Disiplina. Kasi nung panahon ni Marcos, walang magnanakaw, walang nire-rape. Maganda ang wala kang gulong tahimik ang aming buhay. Mapayapa. Nakakatulog kami ng mahimbing kasi maganda ang palakad ng presidente.
Maraming namatay noong martial law dahil hindi sumunod sa patakaran ng Pangulo.
Okay, maraming salamat po.
Magandang araw po. Ako po si Princess Castillo na isa rin pong interviewer ng His Story News. So, ang katanungan ko po is, ano pong naging epekto ng martial law sa kultura?
Maganda kasi nagpatayo si Imelda ng building para makilala ang ating bansa. Para makarating sa ibang lugar na kilalang kilala dahil sa itinayo niya ang building para sa Pilipinas.
Mas nakilala ang Pilipinas.
Maraming salamat po sa inyong kasagutan.
Ng buhay, ako naman po si Junel Iranzo. Gaya nila ay isa ring interviewer ng His Story News. Tila isang malaking katanungan ang naganap noong panahon ng martial law. Gusto ko lang po sanang itanong kung ano ang naging epekto nito sa politiko sa panahon ni Marcos.
Maganda rin, disiplinado ang mga congressman, kung disiplinado, walang gulo, walang inggit. Kung sa kuwan ay maganda talaga ang palakad ng ating Presidente Marcos.
Nawala ng kapangyarihan ang politika dahil sa Pangulo, nasa Pangulo.
Maraming salamat po.
Good day, ma'am, sir. My name is Timothy James P. Fule. I am an interviewer from His Story News and I want to ask you a question po. Madalas na naririnig ko po na kay dating Pangulong Marcos daw po yumaman ang Pilipinas, ngunit sa kamay niya rin daw po ito naghirap. Totoo po ba ito? At nais ko rin pong itanong kung ano po ang naging epekto ng martial law sa ekonomiya ng ating bansa.
Hindi ako naniniwala ako na si Marcos, nung naging presidente, yumaman ng Pilipinas. Pero hindi ako naniniwala, kaya naghirap ang Pilipinas ay gawa ni Marcos. Kasi maraming naiinggit sa kanya, kaya naghirap ang Pilipinas. Pero ang totoo, maraming nagawa si Marcos nung siya ang nakaupo. Kaya ipinagmamalaki ko ang presidenteng yon. Dahil maganda ang palakad, marami lang sumisira sa kanyang pagkatao.
Hindi po na ang Pilipinas hindi mama at dahil kinurakot ng Marcos ang kayamanan. Kinurakot nila ang mga kayamanan na sa kanilang lahat ng kayamanan ng sambayanan.
Maraming salamat po sa inyong kasagutan.
Ang sabi nga po ng isa nating na-interview ay sa panahon daw po ni President Marcos ay wala silang naranasan na mga nangyayaring masasama katulad na ng mga nagnanakaw, mga nangre-rape. So, ibig sabihin, maganda talaga ang pagpapalakad sa panahon na iyon. At sa second naman po na na-interview natin, may mga taong may mga namatay din noong martial law dahil sa mga hindi sumusunod sa patakaran ni President Marcos.
Ayon sa pahayag ni na Madam Daisy Vergara and Madam Arsenia Escondo ay naging maganda ang pamamalakad ni Marcos noon panahon ng martial law. At ayon din sa kanilang pahayag na nagpatayo si Imelda Marcos ng building na naging dahilan kung bakit mas nakilala ang Pilipinas sa iba pang bansa.
Makikitang sang-ayon talaga si Lola Daisy sa pamamalakad ni Pangulong Marcos dahil para sa kanya, maayos ang pamuhay noon. Disiplinado ang mga tao at walang mga karahasang mararanasan sa lansangan. Samantala, si Lola Arsenia naman ay nagpahayag ng kanyang opinyon ng hindi pagsang-ayon dahil para sa kanya, ang ilang mga politiko ay nawala ng kapangyarihan. Nanaigang pamumuno ni Pangulong Marcos kaya siya ay binansagang diktador ng karamihan.
Base sa ating mga nakalap, sagot at impormasyon mula sa ating mga nakapanayam ay mayroon tayong mga mahihinuha. Magkaiba sila ng naging tugon sa ating katanungan. Si Lola Daisy ay nagsasabing ang ginawa ni dating Pangulong Marcos ay ang payamanin ng ating bansa at idinagdag pa ni Lola Daisy na maganda ang naging pagpapalakad ni dating Pangulong Marcos sa Pilipinas. Ngunit marami lamang daw na naninira sa dating Pangulo. Sa kabilang banda naman, ang naging sagot ng ating isa pang interviewee na si Lola Arsenia ay para sa kanya ay hindi yumaman ng Pilipinas sapagkat naniniwala siya na kinurakot ni dating Pangulong Marcos ang kayamanan ng ating bansa.
Life choices. What is right and wrong? Years have been passed and this issue is still debatable. The undying regime of the late President Ferdinand E. Marcos. The martial law. When we hear the phrase martial law, people got chills, remember all the traumas and all other things that remind them during that era. But what really is martial law? And what it is purpose? Martial law in the Philippines is also known as Batas Militar. Refers to the various historical instances in which the Philippine head of state placed all or part of the country under the military control. Most prominently during the administration of the late President Marcos. September 21, 1972. When Ferdinand E. Marcos signed the Proclamation Number 1081, placing the Philippines under martial law, claiming that it was the last line of defense against the rising disorder brought on by increasingly violent student demonstrations, alleged communist insurgency threats from the new Communist Party of the Philippines, which is the CPP, and the Muslim Separatist Moro Liberation Front, which is the MNLF. One of his first acts was to detain members of Congress and Constitutional Convention who were opposed to him. except in Muslim areas of the south, where a separate rebellion led by the MNLF erupted in 1973. The first popular reaction to martial law was largely positive. Despite half-hearted attempts to broker a ceasefire, the revolt claimed hundreds of military and civilian lives, and the National Democratic Front, or NDF, were formed to expand the communist insurrection. As stated of Daisy Manzanero, a Filipino citizen who witnessed martial law, in our interview, every people are well disciplined. There are no violence in criminal cases. In terms of culture, Ferdinand E. Marcos, along with his wife, build infrastructures that make the Philippines known in different places and countries. Also, politicians are well respected and disciplined and have the sense of equality during that time. She also stated that the Philippines is a rich country during the term of the late President Ferdinand E. Marcos. And she defended the accusation and issues that during the time of Marcos, the Philippines was a rich country, but also under the same hands, it became a third world country. The regime was able to reduce violent urban crime, collect unregistered firearms, and quell communist insurrections in some places while implementing martial law. At the same time, a number of significant concessions were made to foreign investors, including restrictions on organized labor strikes and the commencement of a land reform program. Marcos announced the approval of the new constitution based on a parliamentary system, in which Marcos himself will be the president and the prime minister. In conclusion to this manner, there is always the advantage and disadvantages where we need to open our mind to understand this kind of situation. We shouldn't overlook the bright side that it gave, but also, it does not mean that we should not forget the dark side of it. And that's all. That's all of my speech, and I hope you learn from it. Thank you so much.
We take a look back at the Martial Law Declaration and the consequent events that shaped the Philippine history. On the evening of September 23, 1972, the late President Ferdinand Marcos appeared on national television to formally announce that the Philippines was under martial law. This began almost 10 years of military rule in the country. Marcos formally ended martial law on January 17, 1981, but it was not until 1986 when democracy was restored after the dictator and his family were forced into exile. Overthrown by a popular uprising that came to be known as the People Power Revolution. There are those who hailed the discipline and supposed order of the new society, as Marcos called it, and then considered it the period as among the best years of the Philippines. Among the myths that the Philippines enjoyed a golden age under the Marcoses, various reports and historical accounts debunks this, while it is true that infrastructure spending increased during that period. It came at a strategic cost, plunging the Philippines in billions of dollars in debt. From $8.2 billion in 1977, the country's debt ballooned to $24.4 billion in 1982, or within a period of just 5 years. The Marcoses also plundered the country's coffers, with various estimating putting the amount at between $5 billion to $10 billion. The Presidential Commission on Good Government, the body going after the Marcoses' ill-gotten wealth, is still recovering this money over the past 30 years. At least 170 billion pesos have been recovered. Aside from the billions in illegally amassed wealth, human rights were abused were rampant during those days. About 70,000 people were imprisoned and 34,000 tortured, according to Amnesty International, while 3,240 were killed from 1972 to 1981. During this dark chapter of the Philippine history, thousands of people were subject to various forms of tortures. Prisoners were electrocuted, beaten up, and strangled. They were burned with a flat iron or cigars. Water was poured down their throats, then forced out by beating. Women were stripped naked and raped. Various objects forced into their genitals. Were the death of democracy since then, the declaration had made people be mute for a moment, and there was no freedom of press. The rights of the people to speak and share their opinions about the current situation were totally denied and deprived. It also created a stronger military power, which caused harm to civilians. Some of the military took advantage while they were close to the president and needed them. It has been many years since then, but the victims have not forgotten, especially as the Marcoses have neither acknowledged their crimes nor made reparations for these sins. At the Supreme Court hearing on the proposed Marcos burial at the Hero Cemetery, victims were asked to speak before the court to recount their horrifying ordeals.
So, martial law cannot be a negative thing in and of itself. Otherwise, the 1935, 1973, and 1987 constitutions would not have given presidential power. Martial law elements are included in even the draft constitution currently under consideration. The only negative thing that can be mentioned is that the current constitution's martial law provisions have been so emasculated as to render them completely useless. Using his commander-in-chief authority, the president might be able to deal with situations much more effectively and rapidly without resorting to martial law. But that is a topic for another day. When Filipinos talk about martial law, they usually think of Ferdinand Marcos' 1972 declaration. There have been at least 5 other declarations in Philippine history, but Marcos is the one that is kept alive in the public mind due to today's political partisanship, despite repeated calls for never again. The time of martial law in our history is a complicated one. People of various backgrounds and experiences have experienced a variety of experiences. Those who took up arms against the state or were sympathetic to them had more distinct narratives than those who lived as quiet, obedient citizens during the period. Others in between had a variety of stories to tell, some favorable, some negative, and many mixed. The issue here is that many of those claiming to be martial law victims are likely to have been detained for crimes rather than political or religious beliefs. What we should be concerned about is whether the charges were valid. One tried and true method is to use the rule of law to investigate and try each individual case with open court hearings, being the best option. A rigorous and objective historical inquiry based on direct witnesses and documentation is required if that is not possible. However, as of today, we don't know and we will never know at the rate we are going. The media is satisfied with portraying martial law victims as heroes who are abused for their fight, which makes no sense. So, even so, the media fails to see that the fight, no matter how novel the goal, frequently entails what the revised penal code defined as rebellion, sedition, arson, property destruction, physical injuries, and murder. So, this is especially important when we consider that the Human Rights Victims Claims Board has only acknowledged 15% of the 75,730 abuse claims filed to date as legitimate. As a matter of fact, human rights violations are a different matter and they should not be discounted in the context of possible state crimes. So that crimes against the Filipino people, which the government is obligated to put an end to hold accountable. Were those who were arrested subjected to abuse? Yes, it appears so. But that is a different topic from whether their arrests were legal and if the people detained were really guilty of the charges listed. Then there is accepting that abuses were committed, whether it was Whether it was a result of policy higher up, failure in controlling soldiers on the ground, or a breakdown in change of command, in other words, attribution. People keep saying never again, but what do they mean? Or do you think it is a case of ineptness? Perhaps corruption while protecting the nation, or is the legislation being used to repress dissent? How will be able to be certain? It would have been fantastic if a court or research group had tried to uncover the truth in a methodical and transparent manner, because individuals were so emotionally committed to either taking the stance of Marcos officials or purported victims of human rights abuses. They failed miserably to examine both sides for veracity. This was never done. So thank you and goodbye.